Uno, dos, tres, ahora sí. Bueno, buenas tardes con todos, todas, todes. Estamos aquí en la sesión, una de las sesiones presidenciales para anunciar y hablar sobre el libro ganador del premio Bryce Wood Award de LASA de este año. Antes de comenzar, quiero hacer un aviso de ley por estas sesiones. En cumplimiento de la Ley 1581 de 2012, les informamos a los y les asistentes que esta conferencia será transmitida por los canales y plataformas de RTBC, el Sistema de Medios Públicos de Colombia, y por las redes sociales de LASA y de la Universidad Javeriana. Bueno, entonces vamos a hacer una sesión bilingüe. Comienzo yo anunciando que justamente este premio, el Bryce Wood Book Award, es un premio que se otorga al mejor libro de estudios latinoamericanos en ciencias sociales y humanidades publicado en inglés. Este año es un premio muy concurrido. Este año LASA recibió 125 libros para evaluación, un número bastante grande. Les quiero contar un poquito el proceso. Fuimos 11 jurados. Cada miembro del comité fue responsable de leer entre 11 y 12 libros durante la primera ronda. Y ya que fuimos un jurado bastante extenso, quiero ir agradeciendo a todos los miembros. Quiero comenzar por Brett Gustafson, que fue mi co-chair aquí en este proceso, de la Universidad de Washington University en St. Louis. Luego a Natalia Sobrevilla Perea, de University of Kent, a Jessica Graham, de University of California, San Diego, a Amnesha Gelman, de Emerson College, luego a Manolo Vela Castañeda, de la Universidad Iberoamericana, a Mariela Noles Cotito, de la Universidad del Pacífico, a Vanessa Miseres, de la University of Notre Dame, Emilio Crenzel, del CONICET y de la UBA, la Universidad de Buenos Aires, luego a Pilar Riaño, de la University of British Columbia, y a Mariana Chugar, de la Universidad de la República. Luego de esta ronda bastante intensa de lecturas, tuvimos 11 finalistas, y luego de esa selección de finalistas, en la segunda ronda, el comité entero leyó a esos 11 finalistas y luego cada uno de ellos procedió a enviarnos a los co-chairs su ranking de los top 3, ¿no? Los top 3 que cada jurado había escogido de esta lista de 11. La calidad de los libros ha sido excelente, ¿no? Así que inicialmente, justo se lo comentaba también a Chelsea hace un momento, pensamos que iba a haber como un debate muy fuerte, y al mismo tiempo, cuando recibimos los resultados de los 11 jurados, tabulamos los resultados y fue fulminante la reacción. Fue prácticamente casi unánime la reacción, ¿no? De otorgar el libro, de otorgar el premio, el Bryce Book Award, al libro de Chelsea Schields, Offshore Attachments, Oil and Intimacy in the Caribbean. Ahora cedo la palabra a Brett Gustafson, mi co-chair, para comentar sobre este libro. Y felicitaciones, Chelsea.
Gracias, gracias Claudia. Un agradecimiento especial a Claudia, que ha sido la que guiaba el proceso. Yo como co-chair, primera vez que estuve en un jurado, así que gracias a Claudia por guiarnos también. Voy a presentar en inglés. Chelsea trabaja en el Caribe y justo trabaja más bien en el idioma holandés. Entonces, con las disculpas del país de Colombia, cambiaré a inglés por ahora. Estos comentarios vienen de la compilación de los comentarios de todos los jurados, es los comentarios que han mandado. Yo estoy más o menos resumiendo aquí lo que se ha dicho sobre el libro Offshore Attachments. Offshore Attachments is a truly noteworthy contribution to Latin American studies. The book introduces an innovative analytical framework that creatively connects the histories of fossil fuel production to the contested management of sex, race, and labor. The book argues that it was through the offshoring of intimacy, the differential regulation of sex and reproduction, that corporate and political leaders sought to commodify oil and accumulate wealth on the Dutch islands of Aruba and Curaçao, once home to the world's largest oil refineries. With its original approach, the book highlights the ways that processes of sex and race regulation, perhaps surprisingly or not, buttressed the world's insatiable thirst for fossil fuels, enabling our collective consumerist and lifestyle desires that drive and are driven by fossil-fueled capitalism. Schields expands the field of energy studies to incorporate sexual and racial perspectives, but also builds on science and technology studies, political economy, and affect theory. In addition, Offshore Attachments brings critical race and Black studies frameworks to the analysis of global petrocapital in the context of Dutch colonialism, the Black Atlantic, and the afterlives of slavery. Absolutely novel work in this field. The book significantly contributes to Latin American and Caribbean studies through an interdisciplinary lens that creatively navigates connections between political economic dimensions on the one hand and effective everyday intimacies on the other hand. With impressive scope and scale, the author draws on historical material from 11 archives and libraries in Curaçao, Aruba, the Netherlands, and the United States. Offshore Attachments is innovative in its rich and evocative, very evocative reconstruction of a specific time and place, while also telling a story that has relevance to the region and the world. In doing so, the book centers the Caribbean in the history of the oil industry. Also very innovative, very important. But also helps to recover the importance of this industry in the Caribbean and in the field, highlighting the often overlooked Dutch islands of Aruba and Curaçao. Usually, Venezuela gets all the attention. Offshore Attachments will be a lasting contribution to scholars working across disciplinary boundaries. And because of that reason, it's an exemplar of the richness and vitality of Latin American studies. Congratulations, Chelsea.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, and I'm just profusely grateful to Claudia and Brett and all of the members of the Bryce Wood Book Award Committee, not only for the honor, but also for the extraordinary amount of labor that goes in to serving on such a jury, and on top of the time already invested that you two volunteered to do more unpaid labor by showing up here is just, I'm so grateful. So receiving this recognition from people who I so admire and who've shaped my thinking on so many issues, it's just an honor beyond words. And I want to thank everyone at LASA, including especially Gisela Blanco, for facilitating our travel in this conversation. So I have to be honest that when I received the notification that I won this award, like on a sidewalk in Washington, D.C., I stopped dead in the middle of the street and immediately took a screenshot of the email and sent it to my father to verify if what I was seeing was correct. And I think that my disbelief owed in large measure to the ambiguous place of the Dutch Caribbean in Latin American and Caribbean studies, because as Dutch colonies, Aruba and Curaçao, which is the subject of my book, they often fall beyond the kind of linguistically defined parameters of Latin America. And those divisions are, of course, the result of colonialism, which have shaped the region, but also our categories of thought. And one of my goals in writing the book was to illuminate precisely that which had been overlooked, namely the vibrancy and the abiding import of regional ties, or the intimacies, so to speak, between the so-called Dutch Caribbean and the wider region. And I say so-called because while that term references a shared history of colonization, it kind of flattens the linguistic and cultural diversity of the islands that fall under that umbrella. So this work wouldn't have been possible without many scholars, librarians, archivists, activists, and other individuals in Aruba and Curaçao who guided my thinking and made possible my research. So many of those individuals are named in my talk today. Others, I want to direct you to the bibliography. If you read one part of the book, let it be the bibliography. So having already evoked the setting of my talk today, I'd like to set the scene a little bit by showing you an image. And I guess I have control of the slides. There we go. Okay. So you're looking at a postcard of a massive oil refinery perched atop a tropical beach on the island of Aruba. And so for many audiences outside of the region, they're often surprised to see distillation towers and gas flares looming over white sand beaches. So many audiences, especially those in the global north, typically do not associate the Caribbean with the age of oil. But in the 1940s, this refinery, which was known as the Lago Refinery, and it was owned by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, was actually the largest oil refinery in the world in terms of daily throughput. And on the neighboring island of Curaçao, which, like Aruba, was also a Dutch colony, the Royal Dutch Shell Group established what became their largest plant in the Western Hemisphere. I can go on and on about the import of these refineries, but one fact that often astonishes people is that during World War II, these refineries supplied over 80% of the Allies' aviation fuel, so quite literally liberating Europe from fascism. So this history is little known outside of the region, but it's worth stating that the vast majority of people in Aruba and Curaçao have deep multi-generational ties to these plants. And so my book, Offshore Attachments, is an attempt to restore the important role of the Caribbean to the history of oil. And more importantly, it's an attempt to rethink the labor that was required to transform oil into wealth. So you've probably heard oil described as black gold or liquid gold, making it seem as though it just bursts out of the ground with immediate value. But that's not the case, and oil could not be commodified into the products that we rely upon today, especially in the early 20th century, without the work of people. And in the Caribbean, the sustenance of that workforce relied upon sexual and reproductive labor, as well as intimate practices thought to encourage hard work and industrial discipline. So simply put, my book argues that sexual energy was embedded in the creation of energy itself. And I'm going to leave that claim a little abstract for a moment while I say something more fundamental. The first thing that bears stating, as Brett already mentioned, is that oil has a Caribbean history, a significant Caribbean history. And frequently it seems as if the importance of the Caribbean to the modern world system stops at the plantation, at the devastating systems of chattel slavery that inaugurated new forms of racialized labor management and uneven global integration. That the plantation inaugurated capitalist modernity is hardly in dispute among scholars today, and perhaps as a consequence of this, we know a lot more about the plantation than we do about that other paradigmatic site of modernity in the Caribbean, which is the oil refinery. It was here in the oil refinery that oil, a material which is of limited use in its crude state, was distilled into an array of petroleum and petrochemical products. So if the plantation served as the locus of capitalism's global growth in the first instance, then it's my contention that the Caribbean oil refinery would be no less vital to its seemingly limitless expansion in the 20th century. Caribbean refineries produced a range of petroleum products from diesel fuel to motor gasoline that all enabled the collapsing of time and space upon which capitalism relies. So corporate managers love to brag about, how important their companies are, but in this case, in the case of this map, I think that Standard Oil got it right. Locating Aruba at the center of the world. And what I love about this map is, one, that it quite literally shows how oil can create this cartographic imagination, but it also forces us to see the world anew by moving the periphery to the center. I get a lot of mileage out of this map. And one slightly funny thing is that when I emailed ExxonMobil to ask for permission to print this in the book, which they graciously agreed to, the email signature of the man who responded said, "Think about the environment before you print this email." So I thought that was rich. So although they're often peripheral to Caribbean histories and studies, especially for the 20th century, the Dutch islands of Aruba and Curaçao were actually the first plants, they housed the first plants that were built in the region to process foreign crude that was coming just 30 miles south from Venezuela, a country that you can sometimes see across to on a clear day. Much of that oil coming from the very oil-rich Lake Maracaibo. But it wasn't just proximity to Venezuela that made these islands attractive for the development of oil infrastructure. It was also specifically their dependent nature. So this explains why, by the late 20th century, over a dozen refineries had appeared in islands like Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, specifically St. Croix. I'm not a GIS person, as you can tell. This is cribbed from Google Maps. And like the refineries on Aruba and Curacao, many of these plants were built in territories that are still part of the states that colonized them. So to this very day, Aruba and Curacao remain unevenly integrated into the European Netherlands. This fragmented sovereignty proved essential to oil corporations because the political and military might of large global north countries like the United States or the Netherlands appeared to guarantee stability for foreign investment. And at the same time, the imbalanced incorporation of Caribbean islands into Euro-American legal regimes also created numerous profitable loopholes, from relaxed labor and environmental regulations, tax holidays, you name it, right? All of this happened on Aruba and Curacao as well. So these are all hallmarks of what scholars call the offshore economy. And broadly speaking, this term denotes a space of minimal or loose oversight in the production of profit. And often, as Shana Potts argues, it conjures images of billionaires drinking out of coconuts on an isolated tropical island, or like a lone oil rig plumbing deep water hydrocarbon deposits out, beyond the bounds of regulatory capitalism. But seductive as those images often are, they really uphold this fantasy that the offshore is a zone of tropical lawlessness where anything goes, whereas the onshore of, say, continental Europe or the mainland United States, these are sites of order and logic where rules, discipline, capitalism. But on Aruba and Curacao, transnational oil companies and Western governments deliberately carved out these legally distinct spaces in order to reproduce wealth, much of which was funneled back onshore to Europe and North America. So the offshore is not removed from the onshore. Rather, global capitalism relies upon these zones of apparent exceptionality in order to grow. And this is something that the anthropologist Louis Reumer has explored also in Curacao. So I found this to be a really useful framework to think through, because as I made my way through the archives, it seemed that oil companies and their state protectors didn't just avoid laws regulating taxes and labor. They also systematically broke statutes pertaining to far more intimate terrains, including sex, reproduction, and the family. These were concerns that were always inseparable from the making and management of race, and this was my second important discovery. From the oil boom in the mid-20th century to its eventual bust in the 1980s, my book tracks how oil companies and governments sought to encourage new values around family, gender, and desire to manage the labor force and to produce immense profits. So these elite actors believed that creating different kinds of intimacy would make workers compliant or easily controlled. And by intimacy, I mean a range of behaviors, from family life to reproductive practices, who has children and under what conditions, to forms of gender expression, what does it mean to be properly masculine or feminine. And they did this often by stretching or usurping laws. And they rationalized these actions by pointing always to the primacy of the oil economy. So we could say, in a sense, that sex itself was offshored in the creation of a new global energy system. And I want to give you just some examples of what I mean by this, and I'm happy to say a lot more in the Q&A. So from oil camps, whether in Mexico or Saudi Arabia, we see that oil companies often relied upon a racially segregated workforce. And the same was absolutely true on Aruba and Curacao. Part of what shored up and created those racial boundaries was the regulation of sex and family life. White US Americans and Europeans who often worked in so-called skilled office and engineering jobs could live in the field with their family, thus legitimizing their claims to respectability. But a migratory workforce of men from the Caribbean region and Latin America, including right here in Colombia and Venezuela, but also workers from China and poor whites from Portugal, were recruited to do the actual value-producing physical labor of turning crude into commodity. And these men were largely forced to travel alone, so that oil companies could dodge the costs associated with family wages and the construction of appropriate dwellings. And not least, without ties of kin, these men, managers reasoned, could be quickly deported if they posed a political problem, which happened a lot. These refineries were regarded as schools of unionism in the broader Caribbean region, or if demand fluctuated. They're literally the flexible reserve army of labor theorized by Marx. But corporate managers and colonial officials also believed in the innate and implacable heterosexual, always heterosexual desire of men. So they rationalized denying men of color marital and family ties by instead facilitating access to commercial sex. And quite paradoxically, this was expressly prohibited by Dutch colonial law. So prostitution was technically illegal, but third-party facilitation was not. And here you had the role of the colonial state then acting as a procurer. And on this topic, I'm extremely indebted to the work of Kamala Kempadu and Jackie Martis, as well as Mario Klein. So although fundamentally illicit, the system of sex worker recruitment was highly state regulated. So basically, colonial authorities worried that if men were denied access to light-skinned women's sexuality, then oil workers and US soldiers who came to defend the refineries during World War II would begin to harass the white wives and daughters of elites on Aruba and Curacao. So because of these racist valuations of white women's alleged desirability, officials recruited specifically light-skinned sex workers from the Dominican Republic, to a lesser extent Colombia, and these women were made to follow the same calculus of transience as were male production workers. Their short-term visas were enforced, and authorities wanted high turnover so that sex workers could not make permanent claims to the islands. The same logic that was in place for the men who they provided companionship to. So sex workers came to reside in hotels, not unlike this one that you see here. This one was known as Hollywood in San Nicolas, Aruba. And the routine went something like this. Women would stand on the porch, as you see here, and clients would line up on the street below. After a shift, the line would move around a city block, and taxis would wait to ferry these people to beaches, where they would go beachy, beachy, which was, well, you fill that in. So everyone who traveled along the commodity chain of oil in the mid-20th century knew about this spectacle. The Guyanese author E.R. Braithwaite talks about this in his book, To Sir with Love. And this was one of my favorite archival discoveries that you see here because, well, one, it was found in the family photo album of a US roughneck who'd come to prepare the refinery grounds in the 1920s in Aruba, and he'd labeled it just Hollywood. So surely his wife and children who looked at this photo album years later had no idea what they were looking at. But it's fascinating to me because it confirms precisely what I had been reading so much about, which was that these brothels were one of the few spaces of sociality in the refinery where lines of race and class blurred. And above all, what I think this example reveals is how the Dutch colonial government, in concert with oil companies, routinely circumvented laws regulating intimacy in order to build an oil economy. So far from sex work simply arising wherever large groups of men concentrate, as is so often assumed, the provision of intimacy was instead really a central managerial strategy engineered to produce profit. But intimacy was not just a site of control. As the book shows, it was also a site of struggle. Crucially, the demands of Caribbean people to control their own romantic lives and household arrangements could transform the industry from the ground up. And these struggles involved not just elites, but also male production workers, housewives, sex workers, domestic workers, and many other men and women orbiting the industry. So following from my prior example, the independent actions and desires of foreign sex workers often sent local authorities scrambling to curtail their sexual and erotic autonomy and their economic autonomy as well. You're looking at police and immigration records for sex workers coming from the Dominican Republic who had sought to solidify marriages to Dutch subjects, sometimes strategic, sometimes sincere, in an effort to remain on the islands. And repeatedly, they attempted to bring their daughters, their sisters, and other kin to join them. So the archives that track their movements regarded these women as opportunistic criminals that were trying to skirt the restrictions of their visas. And while we don't have their voice in the archival record, feminist scholars such as Rosemary Allen and Margot Groenewoud have insisted that we have the ability to read for acts, the acts that puncture the silence of the archive. In these immigration and police reports, we see women repeatedly attempting to bring kin to a prosperous island. This was an economic and cultural practice of mobility that was quite familiar to the Caribbean world. And just as importantly, as energy humanities scholars have shown, oil also seeped into subjectivities and desires. In the culture of these company towns, corporations actually promoted domesticity for local workers. This was in contrast to the migrant workers who formed roughly half of the workforce of these plants. And they made the advancement of local men dependent upon their emulation of white US and European family norms. This was thought to be a disciplining force for people who couldn't simply be sent away if they posed problems. Now, for some, marriage was not an unwelcome imposition, bespeaking as it did a status that was most often associated with light-skinned colonial elites. Many Aruban women, for instance, seized on these discourses of corporate paternalism and domesticity to demand the abolition of commercial sex work. This is something that Luca Lofts has written about. And their protests in 1951 actually managed to successfully turn those discourses of paternalism back on the corporation itself. And for a brief time, the Dutch government actually suspended this practice of recruiting foreign sex workers in response. So some arguments about sex conformed to corporate values, even as they challenged corporate practice. But others were altogether more subversive. And some of the most surprising sources that I worked with concerned radical movements in the 1960s as the oil industry waned in the aftermath of automation and as this pervasive practice of subcontracting out refinery work to lesser paid and often more precariously employed workers really plummeted the amount of jobs that were available. So radical students and labor leaders began at this moment to reflect on oil's peculiar sexual economy. And the conjunction opened up a lot of clever thinking about the relationship between sex and capitalism. So these folks argued that if capitalism had controlled people in the bedroom, then liberation would necessarily be achieved there too. So these leftists insisted that sexual liberation was a key part of securing economic and political self-determination. And quite unlike other revolutionary nationalist movements at this time, these actors actually made anti-imperial arguments to defend reproductive rights, so they weren't necessarily pronatalist. And they also defended non-normative desire, especially among men, as an emancipatory act. This is something that you can read more about in the work of Julian Yesenia. So, to conclude, turning to that other paradigmatic site of modernity in the Caribbean, the oil refinery, we see that race and sex mattered to the building of an oil economy. On Aruba and on Curacao, intimacy was differentially and often illegally regulated to reproduce wealth. Yet at the same time, we also see that oil companies did not merely intervene into the intimate lives of unwitting subjects. Those subjects also launched their own arguments about oil and intimacy to shape corporate practice and state policy and to make their own claims to community and kinship. So in the words of M. Jackie Alexander, the intimate was at once a locus of power and a site of its own instability. Now, despite the importance of the industry that I've outlined today, for many, the Caribbean appears as this unlikely center of the hydrocarbon age, and instead its significance is often obscured by popular representations of the Caribbean as a tourist paradise untouched by history. This is itself a colonial representation that paved the way for conquest. But as Ryan Jobson has argued, the framing of the Caribbean as an unlikely center of petrocapitalism overlooks these histories of racialized labor exploitation that initially positioned the region as a fulcrum of modernity and have today made the region a likely candidate for other extractive and industrial enterprises that rely on the ethnic and racial division of labor. Though they're not analogous in their methods of control or oversight, slavery and oil constituted two quintessentially modern industries in the Caribbean that had consequences for the world as a whole. But the study of the so-called Dutch Caribbean is most often confined to the former. To the extent that the islands feature in the history of capitalism, in which the Dutch have played such a conspicuous role, it's really in the early modern era, or the profoundly misnamed Golden Age, when the theft of African men and women made the Netherlands the world's first global hegemon, in the words of Wallerstein. But attention to the history of oil, arguably global capitalism's most valuable commodity, draws the Dutch Caribbean into the crosshairs of modernity once again. And equally indispensable for understanding this fossil-fueled age that we live in are the intimate acts engendered labor that nurtured, sustained, and at times contested the terms of this global energy system. And just to wrap up here, I also believe that the lens of oil allows us to see the intimacies that link Aruba and Curaçao with Latin America and the Caribbean. Laborers and commodity chains traversed these sites, and enduring familial and cultural ties emerged as a result. So this is why I'm so honored to receive the Bryce Wood Book Award, because for me this is a recognition of the place of these islands, these incredibly important and often overlooked islands in the history of the region writ large. So thank you for being here, and I'll look forward to your questions. Or comments, or a reflective moment of silence.
I'm Heidi Tinsman, historian of gender and labor in Chile, and also Chelsea's colleague at UC Irvine. This is an extraordinary book. I actually have a comment for the committee. I want to, I've been coming to LASA for 30 years, and I am so pleased. This isn't just because, thank you for choosing my colleague, who's marvelous, and whatever. I'd like to know a little bit more about the conversations within the committee to decide affirmatively that this book, which is not about Spanish-speaking Caribbean or Portuguese-speaking parts of, it defies the way in which Latin America, we say Latin America and the Caribbean, but LASA has largely been Latin America as imagined through the Luso-Iberian empires, right? And, we push against that, right? Sometimes there's a panel on Haiti, sometimes, very occasionally, almost never, we get something on the so-called British Caribbean. We're trapped in these colonial categories, right? But it's a wonderful choice because this book belongs at LASA, right? And it's exciting to see LASA has transformed so much over the years, will continue to transform. But I'm interested in, if the committee talked amongst itself about, hey, this book, not only is it spectacular in its analysis of sexuality and capitalism and the arguments it's making, but it matters so much because it fundamentally challenges what counts as the Caribbean as it's being constituted in relationship to Latin America. And then Chelsea, this is like a little nerdy question for you, but since we are in Colombia, right, and there are some Colombians and Venezolanos who end up getting recruited to work in these refineries. I mean, what do we know about, the way that, oil corporations maybe build on some of the other, models that were at work in Venezuela or Colombia in terms of relying on or incentivizing migrant labor to exploit for agro, petro, export industries. But anyway, thank you, committee, and yay Caribbean, yay, and maybe there's many parts of South America and Central America that do not speak Spanish or Portuguese as their main languages, right? And they're usually not at LASA, right? So anyway.
Okay, can we make the switch? We still keep it in English. ¿Cómo lo hacemos? What do you want? What do you prefer? What do you prefer? Okay. Lo primero y lo más importante, y es como like a kind of obvious in what Brett read, it's a brilliant book. No, I mean, it's not just saying that. It's actually, I mean, cuando encuentras un libro así, y creo que esa fue la reacción primera del jurado, brillante en el sentido de que es un libro que hace una lectura realmente nueva, de varios campos, ¿no? Y honestamente para mí para mí, lo digo yo ahora como miembro del jurado y no como como co-chair del comité, llega un punto que justamente esa mirada brillante que atraviesa campos, ves que incluso puede ampliar Latin American Studies. Y es esa mirada, ¿no? Que justo te hace trascender la geopolítica, aunque justamente es una mirada que también transforma la geopolítica, ¿no? O sea, con solo eso empecemos por ahí. Brett, dime.
Bueno, no tengo mucho que agregar. Es verdad que no entró en la discusión, bueno, tenemos que dar un premio a un libro sobre el Caribe. O sea,
Sí.
eso no entró. ¿No? Más bien, bueno, yo soy también estudiante de temas petroleros y a mí me gustaba el libro y dentro de mí decía, bueno, yo quisiera que gane pero no puedo decir nada. Pero al final todos querían que gane. Y justamente por las razones que dice Claudia.
Además que en estos 125, que son bastantes libros, 125 son bastantes, el nivel fue bastante bueno también, ¿no? O sea que en ese nivel, de muy buen nivel de libros, en el supernivel de los 11 finalistas, que el libro ganara lo dice mucho.
Y una cosita más, somos latinoamericanistas y caribeñistas. Y lo lindo de este libro es que salió de las fronteras disciplinares y cruzó, se encajó con temas de economía política, pero también con temas de intimidades, afecto y bueno, eso creo que, bueno, como latinoamericanista eso es lo que buscamos. Entonces, eso creo que también el libro se resalta por eso, porque hace lo que queremos hacer en estudios, en LASA. El hecho que se trataba del Caribe, bueno, bien también.
Sí. Fue una apertura además como grupo, ¿no? Donde además no hubo ese debate que se hubiera esperado quizás hace unos 20 años, ¿no? Sobre qué implica o en qué situación están estas islas dentro de estudios latinoamericanismos. Probablemente hubiera sido, no ingresan porque es la colonia holandesa, ¿no? Pero en este caso fue lo queremos en el campo, ¿no? Que yo creo que fue eso de absorberlo también, ¿no? Sí.
La pregunta
Thank you for the nerdy question. I love a nerdy question. So oil companies are constantly learning transnationally, and the archives are full of examples and kind of hypocrisies, right? So initially when Shell signs the lease in 1915 to open the refinery in Curaçao, they actually specifically reject local men as a viable labor source, repeating all kinds of racist tropes about how slavery didn't instill the ethic of work. I mean, they totally overlooked the fact that for local men, there's no incentive to wage labor, right? I mean, as we all know, like having a boss and showing up to work at the same time every day, like who wants to live like that, right? Yeah, exactly. So these were communities that valued, that sought their freedom dreams in subsistence agriculture and having autonomy over their time and their labor. So initially, those local men are rejected as a viable labor source, and they go then to Venezuela, to Colombia, where there were men who had experience in oil camps. But at the same time, right, that Shell is rejecting local men in Curaçao, they're employing those same men. They're bringing men from Curaçao to work in Venezuelan oil camps. This was part of that practice of labor churning that was really designed to try to create this totally flexibilized labor force who could be expelled for any number of reasons. And they're also learning different strategies of social reproduction. So Venezuelan and Colombia workers in Curaçao were thought to be nationalist and therefore dangerous and potentially bringing toxic ideas about national revolutions, which they did. And so those men, some of those men actually got to come with their families because they thought these people need to be disciplined by marital life and by family ties. They're not just learning from the region, though. Shell was founded in Indonesia, another Dutch colony. And so Shell oilmen are constantly writing from Indonesia to Curaçao to say, we're getting much better results when we allow our migrant workers to come with families. So these strategies of managing social reproduction and intimacy change, and they change in dialogue with fossil-fueled capitalism globally. And this is a reason why I found, this framework of the offshore to be really useful, because just keeping the empire view, just looking between metropole and colony, it just far limited the kinds of ties that were important for the creation of this particular industry.
Voy a hacer esta pregunta en inglés para Chelsea. So actually, I guess a couple questions. The first was just maybe if you could explain the cover a little bit, because it really drew my eye, especially what looks like a kind of drop of oil, and the things maybe you can see within it. And then also, I just had a kind of like intellectual curiosity about the different literatures that you drew upon that didn't have anything to do with oil. And when I was listening to your presentation, I was completely blown away just by the subject and the way you handled it and the way that you beautifully delivered everything. And so it really made me think about different ways of thinking about, for instance, like U.S. militarism. Just kind of cited approaches where you can think about the kind of relations on the ground that inform the bigger politics. So I was thinking about U.S. militarism, I'm thinking about other forms of extractivism that you might have drawn from, and that maybe you think that this book informs.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions and the comments. The cover, I'm going to have a disappointing answer to that, which is that I had no power over it, but I was extremely happy with how it turned out. This was something designed by one of the designers at UC Press, and I interpret it, I never got to talk to the designer, but I interpret it as a kind of oil Rorschach that for me, I mean, when I saw it at first, I was like, what? And then I was like, oh my God, brilliant. Because it links the thematics of oil and fantasies, right? And the way that these kind of racialized, sexualized fantasies form part of what oil as a commodity is. So that's my interpretation. But I should ask you how you interpret it, because that's the Rorschach test. And about these different literatures, absolutely the scholarship on US militarism and the kind of creations of brothels at different US military outposts was extremely important for me. Harvey Neptune's book, Caliban and the Yankees, about the US military coming to Trinidad in the Second World War. It's a fantastic book and really influenced my thinking. As for other extractive industries, I mean, historians of Latin America and the Caribbean have done so much, from Chile's copper mines to bauxite mining in Suriname, to factories in Colombia, to look at the way that industrial labor was managed through like gendered enticements to form families or not. We could think of the banana enclaves, in which case, the United Fruit Company actually doesn't care about that civilizing mission. So the fact that industries pay attention to social reproduction as part of their daily business is certainly well studied in this region. And I think that what we sometimes miss, though, specifically about oil as a commodity, is that what Hannah Appel says, like this metonymic property of oil as black gold, really overlooks the fact that oil has social reproductive grounds. And so we haven't quite grappled in the same way with the social reproductive dimensions of oil as commodity. And that's where I hope to add to the conversation.
¿Sabemos si hay preguntas en Zoom? you mentioned nationalism, or the sort of the threat of nationalist sentiments infiltrating from other countries, and you know, the offshoring. We know it was partly about the regulation of labor, but can you say a little bit more about it? How it was about the regulation of ideology as well, which you alluded to, and it's in the book, but I'm just interested to hear a little bit more about that. Because it seems like that was also fundamental to avoid the threat of nationalization, or the threat of government claims or control over private industry production.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think it explains why the Caribbean became this key destination for enclave refineries in a region that is largely thought, with a couple of exceptions, to be totally devoid of independent oil reserves. But that was precisely part of the region's allure, because it meant that, unlike what they saw happening in Bolivia or in Mexico, like that mineral wealth couldn't be nationalized. And that if there were eruptions of unrest among oil workers, who are notoriously some of the most militant in the region, that those could be subdued by powerful militaries like those of the United States, or, I mean, the Netherlands wasn't especially known for its big military, but nevertheless, the colonial state apparatus was thought to provide a lot of assurance against nationalist ideas that were, say, brewing in Venezuela. And in the early 20th century, Venezuela's leader preferred that as well, preferred to offshore the oil refineries to Aruba and Curacao in order to not have these radical laborers on his own terrain. And that would be, you know, corrected after his death in the 1940s.
Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, nuevamente felicidades a Chelsea. Congratulations to Chelsea. And por mi parte también, gracias de nuevo a Claudia Salazar, mi co-chair, y gracias a ustedes por estar con nosotros.